Hey guys, welcome to a part 2 of my previous tutorial that I did, which was about horror games and things to look out for and mistakes to try and not do. And I thought of some more very important things that I missed out in the last video. Well, I didn't want the video to be that much longer, so I'm going to cover some extra bits today, and hopefully this again can help you with your horror game and among other games which might be of the 3D space. One thing I wanted to ask is that with me doing these types of videos, would people find it interesting if I sort of played maybe a snippet of a certain game like Resident Evil 7 and sort of talk through the way they might have done things, the things that I don't like, the things that they did well, and the things that you can sort of take inspiration from, and maybe do sort of a not so much a live commentary, but a commentary as I'm playing the game. Not so much as a sort of let's play, it's more of a sort of developer insight into the things that they might have done. Because I don't know how many people will end up watching this or are interested in making horror games themselves, but you let me know in the comments. So, like I mentioned last time about believability, I'm maybe going to talk more about things that are quite annoying if you don't sort of, keep it sort of very minimal. And one thing that you might see in a lot of games is when you use a head bob, is when the character might bob a lot. So when there's head bob on the character or something like that, so when you step, realistically in real life, you don't step perfectly, in line every time, but head bob isn't very realistic because when we walk we don't really notice it very much because the brain works it out in a particular way, and it's just sometimes in a lot of games when I know it's nice to put a little bit in if you're subtle with the head bob, but sometimes it's a little bit overdone and it just looks a bit jarring if when every footstep you take is a really big sort of bob up and down. So if you minimize that and you can have a head bob a little bit just to add a little bit of realism there. One thing moreover on the subject of flashlights and things that I mentioned in the previous video is a spotlight, or the spotlight angle of which you create for your actual torch or your flashlight itself. You want to make sure that it encompasses a large enough area to make it feel, realistic, make it feel not too, tedious to try and point your flashlight around and look at different objects. If you go into a dark room and actually use a flashlight yourself, it won't be just this little pinpoint area which you can barely even see anything. It will actually illuminate a very large area, and with the sort of light fall off, you get a very large radius of which you can see. So be mindful that you want to be able to, make the player not frustrated when trying to search through your game, and make the spot angle big enough so it isn't a hindrance. One thing that I noticed, and I've noticed this in, AAA titles and things, I think, where did I notice it? It was Resident Evil Revelations, and midway through the game, as I recall, I think one of the bathrooms in the game, I swear, the toilets looked really big and the sinks looked really big, and even the cubicles, it was just weird, it was out of proportion, and you don't normally see that in games which, have taken extra care when they've been designed. You see it in a lot of more, very indie, let's say, games where scale is not everyone's sort of forte, but it's very important. And the way that I get around it is in your modelling program or anything like that, you set yourself up a scale, and say you create yourself a 6-foot character or just a 6-foot block, which might be about 1.8 meters tall, and you just base all your assets on that, and then you can scale up and down in your engine as you need to, so you always keep a consistent style, so you don't have one absolutely massive sink, a massive chair. And what goes hand in hand with that is make sure your character isn't low. As I say, that can sort of be a symptom of the same type of thing. If your character's too small, your assets might be too big, and make sure your character's big enough that it doesn't look like a child, unless you are going for a game which you are playing as a child, which is fair enough. But if you're playing as an adult, you don't want to be, below the desk or with your head just above the desk, or you want to make sure that you go up to things in real life and decide to yourself, where's my waist, depending on how tall you are. Where's your waist compared to the door handle? Where's your waist compared to your table? Where's your waist compared to the sink? How big is this object against another? And one thing that always annoys me in games is, it's entirely up to you, obviously, with most of the things that happen, but Walking upstairs is one thing that, say you had let's imagine a box collider on each of the step, your character would have to sort of jump up these large sort of squares, and you sometimes, in some games that I've seen even recently, you get a weird sort of bobbing as you go up the stairs because the character has to, get over these large increments. So how I got around it in my game, left alone, is I had a sort of like a cube collider, and I made it big enough and it almost acted like a ramp across all of the stairs, so you didn't get any weird bobbing, you just sort of went up a big slope. You don't see the collider because, you just get rid of the mesh renderer and whatnot, but you can get away from that awful, awkward sort of bobbing up the stairs if you just make a nice, even slope all the way up the stairs that you've got. One thing that's a big thing that it's not always the case, but when people have light sources that don't have, say, a light fixture, and it just looks weird, i.e. if you put a point light in your scene and you've got a hot spot on the left and the right and the wall and the top of the ceiling, and you've got no actual light fixture there, it's all about believability. Most of the time in games that I've seen, say on YouTube and things like that, people don't pick up on it, and it's not a bad thing. Even in AAA games, it's not necessary all of the time to have a light fixture, but if you can, and make yourself a light fixture and you can use it 1,000 times, it can go a long way to just sort of making it look believable. Add an emissive texture to your light bulb or something like that, just to make sure that it looks like it's on, so it isn't just sort of maybe a grey non-lit light bulb or something like that, just to add that element of it does look like that is what it would look like in real life. Again, on the fact of believability, small details go a long way to make something feel, believable. The two fairly good examples were, what I showed in the last video, were Contempt and Precipice, and they had, Contempt especially, you'll notice that if you download the game yourself, it would have pipes running along the house, even wires, little sort of particles, which moths flying around the light. Little things like that go a long way, because you find pipes in real life, and you can, clutter things up by putting alphas on the floor, which could be paper, books, scraps of anything. It doesn't have to be specific to anything. It just makes it look believable in a house. And like I was mentioning before, psychologically in the back of your mind, you know that looks right, and, the walls look cluttered, everything looks like it should, and it just goes and makes it look a lot neater and nicer. One thing that I see again is things like object clipping and 3D models clipping through another thing. So say if you've got a box inside another box, or a curtain through an object, or a door that then clips through the wall. Be careful when you're placing items, or when you animate a door, let's say, and so it doesn't animate too far back and go through the wall, or placing an object through something else. Because, like I keep banging on about, believability, and stuff doesn't clip through things in real life, so, if you can avoid that, especially minimal things, if you're placing hundreds of thousands of assets within a game, it's difficult to minimize them all, but it can go a long way to just sort of be mindful to avoid clipping, especially when you do animations, because it's quite easy to just do it and then forget, especially if you duplicate it over and over. Something that's always really frustrated me is things that, say you open a door in a game, and I've noticed it in some of the some of the smaller indie games, is when you get door sounds that are either door sounds that you've heard before, door sounds that are extremely repetitive or extremely loud. So it's good to just have a subtle, creaky door, let's say, and then, keep that to a minimum. Maybe have 3-4 different random door sounds that happen when you open a door or interact with something like that. Then you can avoid the fact of it sounding the same every single time you open a door. Because if you open a door, it doesn't necessarily, in real life, it won't always make a sound. It's just in games and in movies, you need to add a sound to something, or it just looks odd. One thing that I do more often than not see is really poorly textured door handles and or poorly modeled door handles. And I mean, to a lot of people, it probably doesn't make much difference, but I think, yeah, again, if you're going to duplicate a door maybe 20, 30 times, it's just nice to have, just take a little bit of extra time modelling a door handle and maybe putting a, an actually realistic sort of metallic texture or material onto your door handle, just so it doesn't look so rubbish. It doesn't always need to be, really rusted and things like that, but I suppose, yeah, again, it depends what game you're going for. And I can't recommend something like Substance Painter enough, especially if you're aiming for a sort of 3D, horror game. One of the last things I'm going to mention is, similar to the subject of the doors that I was mentioning before, and you want to be very mindful of your actual door mechanics themselves. And if you look at door mechanics like, say, Resident Evil 7, for instance, you can either push the door as like, with your character as if you were going to push it in real life, or you can press a button and it'll play a sort of animation or adjust it in that way. But you need to be mindful to make sure that your door system or door mechanics work in a lot of different instances, so you want to test it to make sure that you can spam the button lots of times to make sure that it doesn't break it. You don't have doors spinning around, you don't have doors flying off hinges, and if you've got an interaction system with the door, like you interact with a button, and then you have to push the mouse forward or use a controller analog stick, make sure that that's intuitive and works, because there's nothing worse than playing a game and then just the door interaction's annoying, and if you're interacting with a lot of doors, over time can be difficult. So it's important, like I've mentioned before, get people to test it and get people to give you, their opinions on what it's like. I think one more thing to mention is that, say you pick up notes or things that you've got to read, make sure that you use a legible font, and a font or a typeface that you can actually read quite easily, because it's very difficult to have a letter or something that you'll pick up and read, and then it being a font which is extremely difficult to read. A lot of games actually have, when you pick up an object, they will have a button that you press and it will just bring up the sort of an overlay of the text in just a very legible font, which is almost a overlay on what the actual original note would have said, just so you can read it more easily as if you were going to type it out in a Microsoft Word document. It's just to make it easy to read without you having to then struggle reading how it was, originally written, whether that was by hand or a funky style font. And I think, actually, on the subject of fonts and things like that, they're quite important when you're making a logo or things for your game. Choose a font that's appropriate. Don't try and go too crazy and make it look too horror. And by that I mean, try to avoid, just sort of childish, ridiculous fonts that look like you just typed into Google horror font and it looks a bit, garish. You might want, I think Layers of Fear used one of the sort of typefaces. I can't remember what it's called, Face Your Fears or something. It does sort of look like it was painted on, and that's suitable for that style of game. So it's just dependent what you're really going for. But make sure you pick something, especially for things like logos. They can look quite bad if you don't choose the right style of font. So this has gone on probably for longer than I anticipated, but here's some more tips on ways to improve a horror game or any game, because it's got a lot of tips in there that can relate to any really type of game, really. So, yeah, again, thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Cheers.